When my parents told me not to come for Christmas, it was early evening. The streetlights outside were just beginning their nightly glow. My mother's voice was measured a tone that suggested prior rehearsal. She said they would not be celebrating with me this year, that it would be simpler if I stayed away. Before I could formulate a reply, my brother Jason interjected. He suggested we should simply pretend we did not know each other, claiming his fiancée would not be comfortable with a stranger around. He spoke with a disquieting ease, as if erasing me was a minor logistical adjustment for someone more important. I did not argue. I did not dredge up past loyalties or demand an explanation for the sudden shift. I merely said, "Okay," wished them a good night, and ended the call while my hands remained steady. I stood still for a long moment listening to the subsequent silence in my apartment, a profound realization settling over me how effortlessly they had substituted my presence with my absence. 5 days later, I was back in that house facing my father. I placed a sealed envelope into his hands. The mortgage holder asked me to deliver this personally, I told him. He didn't grasp the meaning immediately. None of them did. But by the time my mother came to me, her voice ragged with pleas, Christmas was over. And so was the version of me that used to feel compelled to justify her existence. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 32 years old. For most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough and remained silent enough, my family would eventually truly see me. I thought loyalty was earned by showing up, by quietly fixing problems no one asked me to address, by being the one who never caused friction. I was mistaken about all of it. After hanging up that night, I didn't weep. I stood in the darkened apartment, watching the city's indifferent pulse through the window, and felt an unexpected emotion recognition. It was like receiving a long-awaited diagnosis, only to realize I had instinctively known the truth all along. This was not the first time I had been marginalized. It was simply the first time they had announced it so plainly. I reviewed every Christmas before this one. I was always the first to set the table, the last to leave after cleaning up, while the others settled in the living room with their drinks and laughter. I never sought acknowledgement. I never anticipated applause. But somewhere deeply recessed, I expected them to notice, to know. They did not. To my parents, I was the daughter who handled things, not the daughter who mattered. There is a distinct difference, and it took me 32 years to internalize it. My brother Jason was always the focal point, not because he demanded attention, but because it was freely offered. When he entered the room, my parents gravitated toward him like plants turning toward sunlight. When I entered, they would offer a brief glance before returning to their activities. I used to rationalize it. Jason was older, louder, and required more validation. I manufactured excuses for them because that was simpler than confronting the truth. The truth was stark. They cherished him more. It wasn't a melodramatic, overt preference. No outsider would have necessarily discerned it. But it manifested in 1,000 subtle actions that compounded over decades. In the way my father sought Jason's counsel on financial investments, but never mine despite my expertise in the field. In how my mother spoke of Jason's job as a significant accomplishment, while describing my career with a vague dismissive gesture. In the introductions to strangers, Jason their successful son. I their daughter who worked in events or something of that nature. I worked as a strategic consultant and event host for major financial conferences nationwide, having spent years building a formidable reputation in rooms where billion-dollar decisions were finalized. Yet to my family, I remained the girl who helped with the dishes. The night of the phone call, I sat at my desk and opened a file I hadn't reviewed in months. It contained documents concerning a property on Maple Lane, the modest house where my parents had resided for the past 15 years. They had nearly lost it once, a poor investment, a missed payment, a foreclosure notice that felt like a death sentence. They had called me in a panic, not out of trust, but out of desperation. I had resolved the crisis. I restructured their debt, negotiated with the bank, and through a holding company quietly purchased the mortgage myself. They never suspected. They assumed some benevolent, faceless institution had granted them leniency. They thanked fate, luck, and good timing. They never considered thanking me. I closed the file and placed it aside. For years, I had convinced myself that I didn't require recognition, that integrity was its own reward, that family demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice required silence. But sitting there in the dark, the echo of my brother's voice telling me to pretend I did not exist reverberated. I realized silence had never shielded me. It had only rendered me invisible. I considered my next action. A part of me wanted to call back, to justify, to defend myself, to list every favor, every sacrifice. But I knew the script. They would listen with polite impatience, then patiently explain why Jason's fiancé's comfort superseded my feelings, why I needed to be the understanding one. They would rationalize their cruelty. They would subtly imply that I was the source of the problem. I would not give them that leverage. Instead, I made a decision. Not a spectacular vindictive act, just a quiet resolution to stop holding open a door no one wished to pass through. I picked up the phone and dialed my attorney. I told him I needed to review the terms of the mortgage agreement. I told him that some adjustments might be forthcoming. He asked no questions. He had worked with me long enough to know that such calls were never made without serious cause. When I hung up, I felt an internal shift. Not rage, not victory, just profound clarity. They had erased me from their Christmas. They had erased me from their family portrait. They had done so with such easy finality that it was clear I had never truly been recorded in the narrative to begin with. At that time, I did not classify it as revenge. I saw it as simply closing a door I had foolishly held ajar for years. The week leading up to Christmas passed slowly, the characteristic drag of time when one anticipates something that will never materialize. I maintained my professional routine, office hours, email responses, preparations for a significant financial conference scheduled for January. My days were full, yet beneath the surface a new quiet had taken root. Not a vacuum, but a form of stillness. My family remained silent. No follow-up call to check on my well-being, no message attempting to soften the dismissal. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Their silence served as the definitive confirmation of their words. I was excluded from the plan. On December 23rd, a notification appeared from the family group chat. Not a direct message, but a photograph. My mother had posted an image of the dining table already set for Christmas Eve. 8 place settings, crystal stemware, the special china reserved for biannual use. I counted them meticulously. 8, not 9. They had not merely forgotten me. They had calculated my absence into the arrangement. I closed the app and left it untouched. That afternoon, Richard, a colleague I'd known for nearly a decade and one of the few who had an inkling of my background, called. He inquired in a casual professional manner about my holiday plans. I told him I would be working. He chuckled, responding that it sounded precisely like me. He was unaware of the truth. I did not share it. Some burdens are too heavy to transfer even to a trusted friend. So I allowed him to believe I was simply pathologically dedicated to my career, and we moved on. Yet after the call, I sat with the phone in my hand, struck by the irony. A colleague inquired about my Christmas, while my own bloodline had revoked my invitation. On Christmas Eve, I deliberately worked late. Going home felt like conceding to a vulnerability I was not ready to face. I reviewed contracts, answered messages from overseas clients, and drank long cold coffee, too detached to reheat it. Around 9 o'clock, I drove home. The streets possessed that unique holiday quiet, the kind that signifies everyone is safely tucked away, surrounded by people who welcome them. I passed brightly lit houses, full driveways, and families strolling home from church. I passed everything I had once mistakenly believed was mine. Upon entering my apartment, I didn't switch on the television, pour a drink, or light a candle. None of the rituals people use to ward off solitude. I sat in the darkness, letting the silence fully engulf me. I realized this was the first Christmas of my entire life spent estranged from my family. Even during the demanding years of college and early career building, I had always returned, always shown up, always maintained the belief that it mattered. Now I understood that it had held no significance whatsoever. Christmas morning found me awake early, taking a walk. The streets were deserted, the air frigid and sharp. The houses I'd passed the night before looked different in the daylight, less enchanting, just structures, just people conducting their lives. I pondered my family's activities. My mother, the meticulous general, would be conducting the meal preparations. My father would be in his armchair reading the paper, awaiting the summons to the table. Jason would be present with his fiancée, a woman I'd met only once whose comfort apparently necessitated my expulsion. I doubted they would speak of me. I doubted that amidst the clinking glasses, the shared jokes, and the passing of dishes, anyone would pause to acknowledge the empty chair. I was likely right. That afternoon, I received a call from my bank's private client services. It was a routine check-in to confirm year-end paperwork. I spoke with Patricia, who had managed my accounts for years, and we efficiently reviewed the details. At the call's conclusion, she made a perfunctory note regarding the Maple Lane property, a procedural formality, she assured me. I thanked her and requested the documents be sent directly to my attorney. After hanging up, I looked at the envelope resting on my desk, the one I had prepared 3 days prior, the one containing information my parents were completely unaware they needed. I remained undecided about its fate. A part of me considered letting the arrangement persist indefinitely, choosing invisibility as my permanent state. But the other part, the self that had been awakened by the phone call a week ago, demanded something different, not vengeance, not punitive action, just the plain truth. I had spent a lifetime fixing their problems without seeking credit. The one who provided solutions asked for nothing and offered unconditional love only to receive conditions in return. Perhaps it was time for that dynamic to cease. I picked up the envelope, turning it over in my hands. It was thin, just a few sheets, yet it enclosed a reality that would fundamentally alter their perception of their own lives. I made no final decision that night. I simply held it, sensing its weight, and contemplated the meaning of finally allowing them to see the burden I had carried in isolation. The following morning, I placed the envelope in my bag and went to work. I was still unsure of my course of action, but for the first time in my life, I recognized that the choice was entirely mine. The nature of being overlooked is that it rarely occurs in a single dramatic incident. It is a slow accretion. 1,000 minor moments that culminate in a lifetime spent standing perpetually outside the frame. This thought dominated my reflection in the days following Christmas as my family's silence persisted, and I found myself with an abundance of time for introspection. I wasn't awaiting an apology. That expectation had died years prior, but I was finally seeing with an almost painful lucidity how entrenched this pattern had always been. When I was 10, my father celebrated Jason's birthday with a trip to a baseball game, a significant, often recounted father-son event. 3 months later on my birthday, my father claimed to be too busy. He vaguely promised a special outing soon, which never materialized. My mother provided a cake and a few books. That was my celebration. I never complained. I convinced myself that Jason required more attention due to his academic struggles, while I was inherently self-sufficient. I told myself my parents' love was equally distributed, merely expressed differently. I spun countless falsehoods because the reality was too heavy for a 10-year-old to endure. When I graduated from college, I did so with honors and a job offer from a consulting firm that only recruited the top 5%. My parents attended the ceremony, endured the speeches, and posed for a few photographs. During the subsequent dinner, my father spent the majority of the time discussing Jason's new apartment and whether he would require assistance with the security deposit. I paid for my own apartment. I paid for everything. I had been financially autonomous since the age of 22, and no one in my family appeared to notice or care. The pattern was so steadfast, so deeply ingrained, that I had stopped viewing it as a pattern at all. I had accepted it as the immutable reality. Evelyn handles her own affairs. Evelyn does not require help. Evelyn is fine. But I was not fine. I was profoundly lonely, a loneliness unrelated to physical isolation. I was surrounded by people who shared my DNA but failed to perceive me, who called me family, yet treated me like an inanimate object. The most difficult part was my own complicity. Every unrequested solution, every early arrival and late departure, every instance of accepting their indifference with a practiced smile reinforced the lesson that I was insignificant. I was deliberately scripting myself out of the family history. After my parents' near foreclosure, I had a clear choice. I could have allowed them to face the consequences of their own financial decisions. I could have observed their scramble from a distance. Instead, I intervened. I rectified it. I dissolved the problem so thoroughly that they never truly understood the extent of the danger. I told myself I was being a dutiful daughter claiming the family demanded sacrifice, but the truth was simpler and more melancholy. I was attempting to purchase their affection. I was trying to prove my intrinsic worth through service, hoping that a sufficient offering would finally compel them to see me. They did not. They accepted my contribution and resumed their lives, never questioning the source of their salvation, never wondering if the quiet daughter in the periphery was the reason they retained their home. Reflecting on all this in the week after Christmas, I allowed myself to fully register the emotional toll, not as a victim seeking pity, but as an adult finally willing to articulate the truth. Their underestimation of me was not accidental. It was a convenient mechanism. I had facilitated their oversight. I had made it effortless. And now, sitting alone with an envelope in my bag and a pivotal decision pending, I understood that the only way to break the pattern was to refuse further participation. I could not force them to see me. I could not compel them to value my actions. But I could cease pretending their emotional blindness did not cause pain, and I could stop insulating them from the repercussions of their own choices. The next morning, I contacted my attorney and requested the preparation of a formal letter. Not an aggressive demand, not an ultimatum, merely a precise delineation of facts my family had never bothered to investigate. It was time for them to fully comprehend who had been quietly sustaining them all along. There is a distinct weariness that accompanies being perpetually useful but fundamentally undervalued. It does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates over years, settling into the core of your being until the memory of feeling unburdened is lost. I had been the family troubleshooter for as long as I could recall. When a dilemma arose, my phone was the one that rang. When a decision was required or a crisis needed diffusing, I answered, and I handled it. Not because of gracious requests or explicit acknowledgments, but because the role was mine. The week after Christmas, my phone remained silent. Initially, the quiet felt like a sensory deprivation, like the discomfort of a missing tooth. Something was profoundly wrong, but the exact deficiency was elusive. Then the realization hit for the first time in years, no one required my problem-solving skills. Of course, they did not need me because they had actively dismissed me. They had designated me a stranger unfit for their table, and strangers are not engaged for emergency assistance. But this is the key truth about being the fixer. The problems do not vanish simply because you step away from solving them. They begin to accumulate until the resulting disorder demands attention. I learned later through a conversation with a cousin who was oblivious to the gravity of her report that my parents had encountered complications with their property taxes. A deadline had lapsed. A penalty had accrued. My father spent an entire afternoon navigating the county office's automated system, growing increasingly agitated with each transfer. Previously, I would have resolved the issue in under 20 minutes. I understood the processes, I knew the specific contacts, but no one called me, and I did not offer assistance. Meanwhile, Jason was immersed in his own complexities. His fiancée wished to renovate the kitchen in their prospective new home, and Jason had agreed to a loan without fully vetting the terms. When he mentioned it to my father, the suggestion was made, "Ask Evelyn to look over the documents." Jason did not ask. To ask would have been an implicit acknowledgement of my capability. He signed the papers carelessly, convinced that everything would resolve itself as it always had for him. It had resolved itself because I had engineered the resolution. But Jason was ignorant of this fact, and he was determined not to learn it by seeking my input. I received a call from my mother during the first week of January. It was not a contrite call, merely a curt message inquiring about my availability to review something for my father. No greeting was offered, no inquiry about my Christmas, just the implicit assumption of my perpetual availability. I allowed the call to divert to voicemail. She called again the next day, her tone less casual, betraying a trace of urgency. Still no apology, still no recognition of the fundamental shift in our relationship. I did not return the call. On the third day, a text message arrived. It was brief, asking if I was receiving their communications. I read it, placed the phone down, and maintained my silence. A profound change had taken place within me, and I refused to deny it. For years, I had defined my identity by my utility to people who withheld valuation. I believed sufficient helpfulness would eventually force them to see me. They never did. And now, for the first time, I was actively choosing not to be helpful, not motivated by bitterness or desire for retribution, but by a simple, deep-seated realization my assistance had never secured what I truly desired, and it never would. The phone continued its persistent buzzing throughout that week. My mother, my father. Eventually, Jason thought his messages were different. He could not comprehend my lack of response. He could not understand why the family's smooth operations had suddenly become labored. I understood completely. I had the necessary lubricant, and now the lubricant was gone. They were finally experiencing the friction. It was not revenge. It was merely the reality of removing myself from a system that had exploited my presence without ever acknowledging my contribution. By the close of the first week of January, my resolution was finalized. I would see my family again, but I would do so on my own terms, and I would refuse the role they expected me to play. When I crossed their threshold again, they would comprehend exactly who had been quietly sustaining their existence all along. The second week of January brought a sudden cold snap, confining most people indoors, and I utilized the time in my office, immersed in preparations for the conference that would dominate my professional calendar. I learned of the initial tangible problem through an email from my attorney. He had received a notification from the county assessor's office regarding the Maple Lane property. A discrepancy in the records likely related to the unusual ownership structure had been flagged during an audit. It was not yet critical, he assured me, but it required formal clarification. I instructed him to manage it as necessary and dismissed the thought. 3 days later, my cousin Meredith called. She was my mother's sister's daughter, once a close friend, though we had naturally drifted apart. Her voice was tentative, the recognizable tone of someone who has been delegated a message and is struggling to frame it. She reported that my mother was anxious, not specifically about me, but about things, about seemingly multiplying complications, about confusing paperwork. I thanked Meredith for the update and assured her I was fine. She sounded relieved to have completed her duty. The problems at my parents' residence continued to accumulate, tracked effortlessly by my peripheral awareness. A late payment notice from the insurance carrier. My father, I learned, spent an entire afternoon on hold with the insurance company, only to be informed he lacked a document he had no knowledge of needing. My mother received a cryptic letter from the bank, and when she sought Jason's interpretation, he simply shrugged it off as likely harmless. It was not harmless. I knew it was not because I understood the inner workings of those systems and the specific consequences of ignoring their warnings. Yet I did not intervene. I sat in my apartment engrossed in reports on economic indicators and market trends and allowed my family to fully experience life without an unseen hand quietly rectifying their every mistake. It was not motivated by malice. It was purely pedagogical. The conference I was preparing for was scheduled for the final week of January, and as the date approached, my professional focus sharpened intensely. I dedicated long, demanding hours to reviewing presentations, coordinating high-profile speakers, and managing complex logistics. This was the realm of my true competence, where my abilities were immediately recognized and duly rewarded. In those crowded ballrooms among those professionals, I was a figure of authority. My judgment was respected. My expertise was sought after and compensated generously. At home, I remained the daughter who worked in events or something similarly vague. The disparity was so stark, so emotionally jarring, that I sometimes doubted my family and my colleagues were speaking of the same person. In one domain, I was essential. In the other, I was disposable. I chose to prioritize the world where I held genuine value. By the third week of January, the calls from my family had become more numerous and desperate. My mother's messages lost their veneer of casual pretense. My father initiated direct calls, a near unprecedented action. Even Jason reached out, though not to apologize. I knew the seriousness of their predicament. I knew because I had engineered the very structure that was now demanding accountability. But I remained silent on the specifics. I offered no details. I simply let the phone ring, the messages accumulate, and the pressure mount. It was not revenge. It was the predictable logical consequence of removing myself from a system that had exploited my presence without ever acknowledging my contribution. They were beginning to sense my absence. Soon they would comprehend its actual cost. The final week of January brought the first clear, if indirect, acknowledgement that the family equilibrium had been disrupted. It manifested not as a formal apology or admission of guilt, but as a question none of them truly wished to articulate. My cousin Meredith called again this time, with less caution and a palpable sense of urgency. She reported that my mother was now directly inquiring about me, demanding to know if I had received their messages, whether I was traveling, if my phone was malfunctioning. The inquiries were superficially pragmatic, yet they concealed a deeper anxiety. A dawning awareness that the daughter they had casually excluded was not rushing back to be excluded once more. I reiterated to Meredith that I was fully engaged with my work. It was an honest deflection. What I withheld was that I had been observing the escalating situation with an unexpected detachment. The Maple Lane property was approaching a critical juncture in its payment cycle, and the confusion my family was grappling with was about to become a crisis they could no longer ignore. My attorney had dispatched the formal notice as instructed. It was not a hostile legal threat, but a technical communication clarifying the property's ownership structure and requesting validation of the current payment arrangement. For most, it would be a mundane document, but for my parents, who had zero understanding of their actual mortgage holder, it generated chaos. That chaos would necessitate questions. Questions would precipitate calls. Calls would inevitably lead them finally to me. I was ready for them. The conference I had prepared for commenced on a Tuesday morning in a massive hotel ballroom populated by individuals whose decisions influenced global markets. I spent 3 days facilitating introducing speakers, managing discussions, ensuring every logistical detail was flawless. By the time the event concluded on Thursday afternoon, I had received accolades from numerous executives and a preliminary offer to significantly expand my consulting engagement with one of the most prominent investment firms in attendance. It was a professional triumph. It was precisely the caliber of success my family had never bothered to understand. When I returned home Thursday evening, 7 voicemails were awaiting me. 3 from my mother, 2 from my father, 1 from Jason, and 1 from an unidentified number I correctly suspected was connected to the bank's legal department. I listened to each one, meticulously observing the evolving tone. My mother's messages began with concern, progressed to frustration, and concluded near panic. My father was terse and bewildered, demanding a return call without providing a context. Jason sounded annoyed, as if my silence was a personal affront, orchestrated solely to inconvenience him. None of them offered an apology. None mentioned the Christmas exclusion. None acknowledged that they had designated me a stranger or that I had spent the holiday alone. They simply required me to step back into my designated role and fix the problem that had landed in their laps. I did not call back that night. I took a shower, ate a simple meal, and went to bed early. The following morning, I reviewed my conference notes and drafted strategic follow-up emails to prospective clients. Around noon, my phone rang. It was my mother. I answered. Her voice was unlike any I had ever heard from her, devoid of anger or command, filled with profound uncertainty. She asked if I was there, a query that implied doubt even after I had picked up. I confirmed I was listening. She spoke of confusion regarding the house, about paperwork, about something they had received from an unfamiliar company. She explained that my father had spent hours trying to make sense of it, and they were hoping I could offer assistance. I asked her to specify the nature of the help required. She hesitated. The pause was long enough for me to hear her shallow breath, long enough to know she was carefully selecting her next words. Then she said they simply needed an explanation, someone who grasped financial complexities. I informed her I would visit that weekend. I told her I would bring the necessary documents to ensure they fully understood the situation. She thanked me. It was the first time she had genuinely thanked me for anything in years. But I registered the omission. She did not apologize for Christmas. She did not acknowledge the exclusion. She did not ask how I had spent the holiday alone or whether her actions had caused distress. She simply wanted me to resume my role as the fixer, acting as if nothing fundamentally had changed. But everything had changed. When I ended the call, I opened my desk drawer and retrieved the envelope I had carried for weeks. Inside was the single document that would definitively explain in clear and irrefutable terms exactly who had been servicing their mortgage for the past 3 years. They sought my understanding. I was preparing to give them an understanding they were utterly unprepared for. I drove to my parents' house on a gray Saturday morning in early February. The winter sky was a uniform flat overcast, making the world feel subdued and aged. I parked behind my mother's car and sat for a moment observing the house where I had grown up. It looked precisely the same shutters, the same porch, the same mailbox my father had installed 2 decades ago and never replaced. But I was fundamentally different, and I could feel that difference acutely as I collected the envelope and stepped into the cold. My mother opened the door before I could knock, indicating she had been watching for my arrival, a sign of worry exceeding her phone demeanor. She offered the strained smile of someone attempting to project normalcy and ushered me inside with small talk about the traffic and the weather, asking if I wanted coffee. I declined the coffee. My father was in the living room, seated in his chair with a folder of papers resting on his lap. He looked up but did not rise. He offered a minimal nod in my direction, a greeting that demanded no effort and conveyed no warmth. Jason was conspicuously absent. My mother explained he was occupied with wedding preparations, implying his absence was a natural scheduling conflict, not a deliberate avoidance of an uncomfortable confrontation. We settled in the living room, the 3 of us arranged in the familiar pattern around the coffee table, which still bore faint rings from my childhood drinks. My mother clasped her hands tightly. My father nervously shuffled his papers. Neither met my gaze. I waited. Finally, my father spoke. He stated there had been issues with the house, with payments, with paperwork. He confessed he could not determine the source of the confusion and hoped I could examine it. I asked him to present the documents he had received. He handed over a disordered pile, and I reviewed them slowly, allowing the silence to deepen. The majority were routine correspondence from the bank, the insurance provider, and the county assessor. But near the bottom was the letter from my attorney's firm, the direct catalyst for their panic. I read it meticulously, feigning unfamiliarity. Then I placed it squarely on the table between us. My mother immediately asked for its meaning. I explained that it signified a change in the legal ownership structure of their mortgage several years prior. I told her the bank they believed held their loan had transferred it to a different entity. She asked who held their mortgage now. I retrieved the envelope from my bag. I had carried it for weeks, anticipating this exact moment, and now that it was here, I felt an almost surreal sense of composure. I handed the envelope to my father and reiterated that the mortgage holder had requested my personal delivery. He opened it with the clumsy movements of someone completely out of his element with official documents. He pulled out the single sheet, read it twice, and then lifted his head. The expression on his face was one I had never witnessed, confusion dissolving into dawning comprehension, followed by shock. The document was succinct, a 1-page summary stating that the mortgage on the Maple Lane property was legally held by Carter Holdings, LLC. The company had been formally established 3 years prior, immediately following their near foreclosure. The sole owner of Carter Holdings, LLC was listed as me. My mother gently took the paper from his paralyzed hands and read it for herself. Then she read it again. Her complexion was drained of color. She asked me, her voice now a whisper, what this meant. I told her it meant that I had been personally financing their mortgage payments for 3 years. I told her I had engineered the debt restructuring when they faced imminent default and had purchased the loan to guarantee the safety of their home. She demanded to know why she had been kept in the dark, why neither of them had known. I explained they had not known because they had not inquired, because they had assumed a faceless bank had shown mercy, because the possibility that I possessed the capability or the motive to intercede had simply never occurred to them. My father buried his face in his hands. A long, suffocating silence ensued. Then my mother did something entirely unexpected. She did not apologize for Christmas. She offered no regret for her actions. Instead, she began to cry, asking me why I hadn't told them. I looked at her at the tears, at the profound incomprehension in her eyes, and felt a sadness completely devoid of vindication. I told her I withheld the information because I wanted their gratitude directed toward me, not my financial resources. I wanted them to see me as their daughter, not merely as their economic failsafe, but I concluded they had never truly seen me at all. She reached for my hand. I allowed the contact, but I did not reciprocate the pressure. I told her I had not come to inflict punishment. I was there to deliver the truth. The subsequent actions were theirs to determine. The days following my visit were characterized by a new heavy silence. Not the absence of sound, but the pregnant quiet of individuals exposed in their failures, paralyzed by an inability to formulate a response. My mother called twice that first week. Both conversations were brief. Her voice meticulously guarded her words, chosen with the hypervigilance of someone navigating a danger zone. She thanked me for the provided information. She said they needed time to process the revelation. She did not apologize for Christmas, nor did she mention Jason's dismissive comment. I had not expected it. Understanding and apology exist on different planes, and my family had always struggled with the latter. What I had failed to anticipate was the calculated campaign that was quickly launched. It began with a call from my Aunt Patricia, my mother's elder sister, the family's perennial diplomat. Her voice was conspicuously warm, almost overly solicitous, as she inquired about my welfare with the careful tone of someone who has received a detailed brief but pretends total ignorance. She mentioned my mother's worry. She suggested the family had noticed my recent distance and wished to convey their care. I expressed my gratitude for her outreach. She then spoke vaguely of the importance of family, the inevitability of misunderstandings, and how words are sometimes uttered without true malice. She cautiously proposed that a Sunday dinner get-together might benefit everyone, allowing for a clearing of the air. I told her I would consider the invitation. Upon hanging up, the strategy became transparent. My parents had refused to address the situation directly. Instead, they were employing intermediaries to exert social pressure. They were managing their reputation before they attempted to repair their relationship with me. The calls continued throughout the week. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years suddenly expressed an overwhelming desire to catch up. A longtime family neighbor mentioned running into my mother at the market. Every conversation carried the same underlying message delivered in slightly varied packaging. Family bonds are paramount. Forgiveness is a virtue. One only possesses a single mother. None of them mentioned my exclusion from Christmas. None acknowledged my brother's deliberate cruelty. None recognized that I had been paying their mortgage for 3 years while they treated me with casual disregard. The narrative they were constructing was simple and self-serving. Evelyn is being unreasonably difficult. Evelyn is nursing a grudge. Evelyn needs to reprioritize what truly matters. It was the same manipulative pattern of my entire life. When faced with their own moral failings, my family's reflex was never to accept accountability. It was to reshape the narrative, casting the fault onto someone else. This time, I was determined not to allow it. An official invitation to Sunday dinner appeared in the family group chat. My mother's message was chirpy, suggesting how lovely it would be to have everyone together again. She noted that Jason and his fiancée would be there, and she hoped I could attend. I hope I can attend. I hope I can. As if my Christmas absence had been a minor scheduling conflict. I declined with a concise message stating I had a prior commitment. I offered no further elaboration. The following day, my father called. The rarity of his direct call made me pause before answering. He typically relied on my mother to filter and manage all family communication. His voice was gruff, the way it always was when he was experiencing profound discomfort. He said he had been reflecting on the housing situation. He claimed he needed a clearer understanding. He asked if I could come over to discuss the next steps. I asked him to define next steps. He hesitated. Then he spoke tentatively about the mortgage agreement, whether it would remain in place, and what my expectations were for their future involvement. It was the first time in my life my father had addressed me as if I possessed actual power. I told him I would contemplate the request. I stressed that I needed to understand the specific nature of the conversation he wished to initiate. A protracted silence followed. He finally said they simply wanted to work things out. They wanted to put the family back together. I asked him what that phrase meant to him. He had no articulate answer. I told him I would call him when I was prepared, and I terminated the conversation. That night I sat alone considering the true nature of my father's request. He was not petitioning for a restoration of our relationship. He was not asking to acknowledge the decades of dismissal and disrespect. He was asking me to seamlessly return to my role as the invisible fixer, the one who effortlessly solved problems and demanded no recompense. He wanted the old beneficial arrangement reinstated. He wanted the benefit without the commensurate cost. I would not comply. The pressure from the extended family persisted for another week. Messages arrived from individuals I hadn't heard from in years, all repeating the same core theme: family is inviolable. Blood connections are absolute. I needed to embody the bigger person. But being the bigger person, I had finally realized almost always meant being the one who silently absorbed the most pain, ensuring everyone else remained emotionally insulated. It meant sacrificing my core needs so that the family could sustain its comfortable delusions. I had been the bigger person for my entire life. It was time for someone else to bear that weight. By mid-February, the subtle pressure campaign had devolved into something desperate. The phone calls escalated in frequency, the messages radiating urgency. I could distinctly feel the change in tenor from gentle manipulation to burgeoning panic. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice strained and brittle, a sound I had never associated with her. She dispensed with small talk. She declared that things were getting complicated. She insisted they needed to know the status of the house. Then she asked me directly what I wanted. It was the first time she had asked me what I wanted in as long as I could possibly remember. I told her I wanted an authentic conversation. I wanted them to acknowledge the Christmas exclusion, to recognize that they had treated me as fundamentally disposable, and to comprehend that their actions were not without consequence. A long, heavy silence ensued on her end. Then she reverted to her defensive strategy. She claimed she didn't understand why I was escalating a mere misunderstanding. She insisted they hadn't intended any malice. She argued that Jason's fiancé was simply anxious in new social settings, and they were trying to facilitate an easier introduction for everyone. I countered that excluding your only daughter from Christmas was not facilitating things for everyone. I told her that my brother calling me a stranger was not a misunderstanding. She began to weep. She said she felt completely lost. She swore they had never intended to cause me pain. I informed her that intent was overshadowed by impact. I told her that regardless of their intent, the undeniable impact was that I spent Christmas alone while they celebrated my planned absence. She then asked what she could do to fix it. I told her that fixing it was no longer my responsibility. I told her I had spent my entire life fixing things for this family, and I was finished. If they desired to repair our relationship, they would have to initiate and execute the work themselves. She did not comprehend the instructions. Her silence confirmed it. She had never been required to repair a fractured relationship before. She had always expected others to concede, to adapt, to forgive without being prompted. I told her to begin by telling the truth, to everyone, to the relatives she had employed to pressure me, to the neighbors she had confided in. I instructed her to cease manipulating the narrative and start acknowledging the objective reality. She vehemently refused. She said it would cause too much embarrassment. I told her clearly and without inflection that her temporary embarrassment did not outweigh my lifelong dignity. The call concluded without resolution. I hung up feeling completely drained yet strangely liberated. I had finally articulated truths I had been suppressing for years, and regardless of my mother's capacity to absorb them, I had at last spoken them. 3 days later, Jason called. His voice was strikingly different. Not angry, not dismissive, but deeply uncertain. He began by saying he had been contemplating the events. He admitted things had gotten out of hand. He conceded that perhaps they hadn't handled everything perfectly. Perhaps, not perfectly. These were evasive words designed to minimize the offense without conceding genuine fault. I listened in silence. He continued expressing concern for Mom and Dad. He claimed the stress was impacting their health. He concluded that whatever the specific issues were, we needed to set them aside for the greater good of the family. I asked him to articulate what he believed the issues were. He paused. Then he confessed he wasn't entirely sure. He said everyone was upset, and his sole wish was for things to return to normal. I told him that normal was precisely what had led us to this point. I told him that normal was defined by my invisibility, my utility, and my disposability. I told him that normal meant he possessed the arbitrary power to decide who was integral to the family and who was not. He protested that he had never intended it that way. He claimed the comment about pretending not to know me was a thoughtless remark made without consideration. I told him that was the core of the problem. He did not need to consider it because dismissing me was an automatic ingrained behavior intrinsic to the way our family functioned. He fell silent. Finally, he spoke the words, "I'm sorry." They were awkward and forced, like a foreign language he was struggling to pronounce, but they were there, suspended between us. I acknowledged his apology. I told him that sorry was a starting point, not a conclusion. I told him that if he truly wished to reconstruct our relationship, he needed to first understand the foundation from which he was building. The call ended soon after. I held my phone reflecting on the encounter. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation I might once have envisioned. There were no raised voices, no mutual accusations, just two people finally engaged in an honest exchange, realizing the profound damage that had accumulated in the silence between them. Whether it would precipitate actual change I could not predict, but for the first time the dialogue had transpired completely on my terms. The final week of February delivered the call I had been anticipating, but still felt utterly unprepared for. It arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon as I was reading by the window, watching the late winter light dim over the city. It was my father. He never called me. In all my adult years, I could count on one hand the times he had initiated direct contact. All familial communication was routed through my mother, carefully filtered and softened before it reached me. But this time was different. His voice was unrecognizable, not gruff, not aloof, simply exhausted. The deep-seated weariness of a person who has been fighting a losing battle. He said we absolutely needed to talk. He said the situation had become serious. He asked if I would come to the house. I agreed to come the following day. When I arrived on Monday afternoon, both my parents were waiting in the living room. My mother's eyes were visibly red, suggesting recent tears. My father sat in his chair, but he made no attempt to conceal himself behind a newspaper or feign busyness. He was fully present, an unprecedented state for him. Jason was also there, standing near the window with his arms crossed. His fiancée was notably absent. I registered the details instantly. No one spoke for a long, uncomfortable moment after I sat down. The silence was thick, charged with the weight of every spoken and unspoken word of the preceding 2 months. My mother eventually broke the tension. She said they now understood. She said the three of them had engaged in a long and difficult discussion about what had transpired and why. She conveyed that they wanted me to know they were deeply sorry. I waited. I had learned to distinguish a genuine apology from a mere strategy to re-establish the status quo. I needed to know which category this fell into. My father spoke next. His voice caught slightly, a surprising display of emotion. I had never witnessed my father's vulnerability. He admitted his lack of understanding. He said he had erroneously spent his entire life believing that providing for his family meant paying the bills and maintaining the roof. He confessed he had never grasped that he wasn't even achieving that his daughter had been quietly bearing the burden he considered his own. He said, learning the truth was painful, not due to anger directed at me, but because of his profound self-reproach. My mother reached across the coffee table for my hand. This time I allowed her to hold it fully. She said she had spent weeks consumed by one question: how could she have missed so much? How could she have marginalized me while I was quietly ensuring their financial stability? She claimed she had no answer, only the crushing recognition of her failure as a mother. Jason stepped forward. He looked visibly uncomfortable, like someone compelled to participate in a discussion he had spent a lifetime avoiding. He offered his apology for his words before Christmas. He admitted he had been thoughtless and cruel, and that no excuse existed for his behavior. He said he had always assumed I needed nothing from the family because I never demanded anything. He now recognized that a lack of demand was not synonymous with a lack of need. He finished by saying he wished to be a better brother, if I would permit it. I looked at each of them. My father humbled for the first time in my recollection, my mother visibly distraught by guilt, my brother grappling with the necessity of evolving beyond his assigned role. I told them I heard their words. I expressed my appreciation that they had finally spoken the necessary truths. Then I articulated my requirements. I told them I required time. I told them that years of pervasive oversight could not be instantly erased by a single conversation, regardless of its sincerity. I affirmed my desire to rebuild our relationship, but insisted it would proceed slowly, on terms that explicitly honored the emotional injury I had sustained. I stated I would not be attending every Sunday dinner. I would not be automatically resolving every problem that arose. I would be present when I chose to be present, and absent when I required personal space. They listened without interruption. They accepted my terms without attempting to negotiate. It was the first time in my life my family had acknowledged and accepted my personal boundaries without attempting to dismantle them. Before departing, I addressed the final matter. I told them about the mortgage and the future arrangement. I would not initiate foreclosure or demand immediate repayment. The arrangement would continue precisely as it had been, but they would now be fully aware of the true source of those monthly payments. My father's eyes were moist when I concluded. He stood across the room and did something he had never done before he embraced me. It was not a perfunctory, obligatory hug. It was genuine. The kind of embrace that communicates what language cannot express. As I drove home that evening, I felt an emotion I hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness, not vindication, peace. March arrived with the subtle promise of spring, and with it a kind of quiet I had never previously known. Not the silence of being ignored, but the profound stillness that follows a violent storm when the air is clean and the tension has dissipated. The truth about my family's mortgage had begun its dissemination throughout the community, as truths inevitably do. Not through sensational public announcements, but through the gradual compounding of overheard fragments and logically connected facts. I heard the details from Meredith, who called one afternoon with a tone blending curiosity and sincere admiration. She reported that people were discussing the situation. She said the prevailing narrative was that I had single-handedly saved my parents' home without ever requesting acknowledgement. She noted that some were openly impressed, while others were deeply embarrassed by their years of underestimating my capabilities. I told her the full truth was far more complex than any single narrative could contain, but thanked her for the update. My parents had honored their commitment to honesty. My mother had ceased her coded complaints about my distance. My father had quietly corrected the false assumptions that had taken root among relatives. Jason had finally disclosed the genuine reason for my Christmas exclusion to his fiancée, and from what I gathered, she had been appalled by their actions. The narrative was being actively corrected. Not because I had forced it, but because the objective truth had finally been granted the space to speak for itself. I received a handwritten letter from Jason's fiancée in mid-March. The medium itself was a surprise, and the content was brief but deeply sincere. She stated Jason had explained everything. She offered her apology for having been an unwitting participant in my exclusion, despite her prior ignorance of the full context. She expressed a sincere hope that we could start anew, and she genuinely looked forward to properly getting to know me. I wrote back accepting her apology and embracing the opportunity to construct a new relationship. The following weeks initiated a slow, deliberate rebuilding. I visited my parents on a Saturday in late March, not because I was commanded, but because I chose to be there. We sat on the porch in the mild air and discussed trivial matters. My mother brought out freshly baked cookies and coffee, and for a few hours we simply existed as a family, flawed but making a concerted effort. My father asked about my professional life, not with his old dismissive tone, but with authentic interest. He asked specific questions and listened intently to the answers. When I described my role at the financial conferences, he nodded slowly and conceded he had never appreciated the complexity of my work. It was a small admission, yet its significance was immense. Jason and his fiancée Sarah came for dinner a few weeks later. This was their first genuine introduction. Sarah was visibly nervous, a quality that instantly endeared her to me. We discussed her work as a physical therapist and the wedding plans for the coming fall. She asked my opinion on venue choices and color schemes, and I offered my honest perspective. It felt like inclusion. It felt like being truly seen. The mortgage arrangement continued as established, but it was now a recognized truth. My parents made their payments monthly, and each month they were fully aware of the recipient of those funds. My father had formally offered to repay the years of debt I had covered without their knowledge, but I declined the offer. I emphasized that the money was secondary. What mattered was the final hard-won understanding between us. By April, the harshest part of the winter was past, and I sensed a corresponding shift in my own internal landscape. I no longer carried the psychological burden of being invisible. I no longer tethered my self-worth to my family's approval. I had constructed a life independent of their validation. I possessed fulfilling work, respectful relationships, and a core sense of self that was not reliant on anyone else's affirmation. My family was now a part of my life, but no longer the defining center of it. That was the enduring gift of the most challenging season of my life. Not revenge, not vindication, but profound freedom. The freedom to define the person I wish to be and to be loved for that authentic self. It is May now, and the city is vibrant with the colors of spring. I sit by my window in the early morning, watching the sunlight extend across the buildings, reflecting on the vast changes that have unfolded since Christmas. 6 months ago, I was a woman shackled by the conviction of my own invisibility. I spent my days serving people who failed to see me, and my nights obsessing over why my efforts never yielded acknowledgement. I measured my self-worth by the sheer volume of my giving, without demanding a return, and I mistakenly called that dynamic love. I now understand that it was not love. It was a coercive transaction I had unknowingly consented to, one where I offered everything and accepted nothing in return. I had minimized my own importance so that others could feel paramount, and I had done it so effectively that I too forgot I deserved better. The phone call that excluded me from Christmas was not the starting point of my story. It was the terminal punctuation mark of one narrative and the decisive beginning of a new one. In the months since that call, I have acquired self-knowledge I wish I had attained years ago. I have learned that establishing boundaries is not an act of betrayal. I have learned that withdrawing from those who inflict pain is not a sign of weakness. I have learned that being indispensable is not synonymous with being valued, and that genuine affection does not necessitate self-erasure. I have also learned that people possess the capacity for change. Not uniformly, not easily, but sometimes. My parents are markedly different people now than they were 6 months ago. They are not suddenly perfect, but they are altered in ways that profoundly matter. They are more attentive listeners. They ask questions they once ignored. They acknowledge my contributions without prompting. This is not the idealized family I yearned for as a child, but it is a family that is actively striving for improvement. And striving, I have come to realize, holds more intrinsic value than unattainable perfection. Jason and I have begun to construct something that resembles a true sibling relationship. He now calls me simply to chat. He seeks my advice on significant decisions, and he respects my counsel even when it contradicts his initial desires. His fiancée Sarah has become a person I genuinely enjoy spending time with, and when they marry in October, I will be present to celebrate with them, not as the unseen assistant, as an honored guest, as a family. My career continues its upward trajectory in ways that are both challenging and deeply gratifying. I have secured new clients and accepted greater responsibilities. I have delivered keynotes at conferences where my expertise is not merely acknowledged, but celebrated. In those professional environments surrounded by individuals who have never once questioned my competence, I am reminded of my true capabilities. But I no longer require those external settings to define me. I carry my intrinsic value within me now, wherever I go. The woman I was 6 months ago would fail to recognize the woman I have become. She would be surprised by my newfound composure, my self-assurance, my willingness to relinquish relationships that diminished me. She would wonder where I found the courage to stop endlessly justifying myself to people who had refused to listen. The answer I now know is simpler than she could have imagined. I found courage the moment I realized that the only person whose complete approval I fundamentally required was my own. I think back to the envelope I carried for those long weeks before presenting it to my father. I reflect on the moment he read the document and finally grasped that his invisible daughter had been the silent architect sustaining his world. I remember the moisture in his eyes, the catch in his voice, and the embrace that transcended all prior communication. That moment was not an act of revenge, it was an act of truth. And truth, I have finally learned, possesses a power far greater than any punitive measure. I do not know the precise future trajectory of my family. I cannot guarantee whether the changes we have initiated will endure or whether old toxic patterns will eventually resurface. What I know with certainty is that I am no longer solely responsible for maintaining the stability of their world. What I know is that I have executed my part, and the balance of responsibility now rests with them. If this story resonates deeply within you, I wish to share one crucial message. You are not isolated. There are countless women who have dedicated their lives to being the fixers, the ones who arrive early and stay late, the ones who give and give until their own reservoirs are utterly depleted. You inherently deserve more. You deserve to be seen for who you are. You deserve to be valued for your intrinsic worth, not merely for your functional contributions. Establishing firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. Walking away from people who consistently refuse to value you is not an act of abandonment. These are fundamental acts of self-respect, and self-respect is the bedrock upon which all subsequent change is built. I spent 32 years attempting to earn my family's acceptance. It was only when I ceased trying that I discovered something infinitely superior. I found my own acceptance. I found peace. The house on Maple Lane remains standing. My parents still reside there, making their monthly payments, now fully cognizant of where those payments are directed. The established financial arrangement continues, not because I require them to remain indebted to me, but because I made a commitment, and I honor my commitments. But the power dynamic has been irrevocably altered. We are no longer a family where one member shoulders the entire weight, while the others comfortably pretend not to notice. We are slowly and imperfectly in the process of becoming something new. That is the ultimate structure I built when I finally stopped explaining myself. Not revenge, not vindication.